Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, and welcome to this very special edition of IPA Encounters with Greg Sheridan. Talking to Greg about his new book, Christians, the urgent case for Jesus in our world, and talking about the role of faith in Australia, in Australian politics, and indeed the role of faith and belief in Western civilization today. I'll be talking to Greg about the book. I'll be talking to Greg about what he learned as he wrote the book, and of course we'll be taking your questions and video questions that have been sent in. I'm coming to you from the IPA's Melbourne offices and the Baillieu Maya Media Centre. Greg is also in Melbourne on Zoom, of course. We've had something like 100 questions sent in. So what I'll be doing is amalgamating some of the questions, picking out some of the key themes of the questions and putting them to Greg. I will introduce Greg now, and then we'll hear from Greg. Greg, of course, is the foreign editor of the Australian newspaper. He is one of Australia's leading, if not the leading commentator on our place in the world, our place in the region, and on the issues that confront us as a nation. Greg is the author of some 8 books, and Greg is a great friend of the IPA. The IPA has been privileged to launch a number of Greg's books in Victoria, and it was only a little while ago that we had a wonderful conversation in person about God is Good for You. Greg has also been part of the IPA's Better Read Than Dead book club series, where he was talking about some of his favourite books with Dr. Bella Debrera, the director of the IPA's Foundations of Western Civilization program. And I'm looking forward to talking to Greg tonight about some of his favourite books. Can I welcome you, Greg? It is great to have you with us, even though we're not in person.
John, it's fantastic to be with you, and my thanks to the IPA. It's a great honour to be associated with the IPA. I'm full of admiration for the IPA. It's a fighting think tank, and it keeps both of those adjectives uppermost in its mind. It's not scared of a fight, and it is also not scared of thinking. So Australia would be a much poorer country without the IPA, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with it tonight.
Thank you, Greg. Congratulations on Christians, the urgent case for Jesus in our world. It's about to become a bestseller, as your previous work on God is now a bestseller with something like 30,000 copies sold. I've read the book. I loved every aspect of it. I really enjoyed the discussion of Jesus as a historical figure, and then Jesus in the modern world, and then the second part of the discussion in the book about politics and religion. Can you talk a little bit about the book and why you think it's so important?
Well, John, it's my second book about Christianity. I sort of came out with the last book, really. And looking back, I can now work out what my purpose was. I'm not quite sure, I didn't necessarily know going forwards, but the great modernist project of disenchantment over the last couple of 100 years has been centred around telling people that Christianity is all baloney. And it does this in 2 parts. It tells people that belief in God is irrational and science has abolished God. And my last book really addressed that. God is good for you. And then the second part of the modernist project of disenchantment was to tell people that the central book of Western civilization, the Bible, especially the New Testament, was all lies and all fraud. Jesus never existed, or if he did exist, he was a, kumbaya, sweet person who believed in full paid maternity leave or something, but he had no religious concerns or anything like that. And that's all baloney too. It turns out that scholarship now is validating the historicity of the New Testament. Somebody said to me in response to the last book, they said, not a bad effort, Greg, at defending the idea that belief in God is rational, but where is the living Jesus? And I asserted in the last book that the personality of Jesus Christ is the centre of the Christian religion. So I spent a couple of years in the New Testament, much more deeply than I ever have before. And I tried to read it as a journalist. So no disguises, I believe it to be true, but I wanted to read it as a journalist, go to first sources, read it with a critical eye, but looking for sources, narrative, incident, meaning. And so I want to demystify the New Testament. It's tremendously accessible. Fabulous human figures like Paul, who's so bad-tempered and irascible and such a wonderful figure, a brilliant, beautiful theologian, a wonderful person, sort of like the Paul Keating to Peter's Bob Hawke or something,
Who's the John Howard in the New Testament, Greg?
So what's that, John?
Who's the John Howard in the New Testament?
Well, I think Peter. Peter is the wise leader. So Peter he's not as smart as Paul. And there's a wonderful passage in Peter where he says, look, I know Paul is a bit difficult, a bit hard to understand, bit difficult, but I tell you what, he is my beloved brother and his writings are scripture. In other words, Peter is saying, you're going to put up with Paul whether you like him or not. And but of course, the central personality of the New Testament is Jesus himself. And I start with the crucifixion because it's so visceral and powerful. I mean, you can't read the New Testament and think it's a fake document. It couldn't be so immediate and so powerful. And in the second chapter, I recount how archaeology and historical scholarship is now validating everything in the New Testament, far from falsifying it. But also the crucifixion, it struck me that the most radical thing about Christianity is not in fact the resurrection, because anyone who believes in God of any kind would believe that God could conquer death. The most radical idea in Christianity is the crucifixion, the idea that the immortal, eternal, omniscient, everlasting God could become a human being, not to triumph, but to suffer defeat, captured by his enemies, torture, humiliation, degradation, near despair on the cross, not despair, but the temptation to despair. And so I thought this was extraordinarily compelling. So the first half of the book is a search for Jesus and his first friends, chapters on Paul and Mary, chapter on John's Gospel. And of course, John's Gospel is one of the most astonishing works of literature in human history. And just incidentally, isn't it crazy that we subject all our kids to a safe school program, but we make sure that they're never going to read anything magnificent like the John's Gospel or the letter of Paul to the Galatians? One of the great Paul scholars, N.T. Wright, argues that Paul is such a critical figure in human history and his writings are so powerful and so important. He should be taught in history courses, philosophy courses, psychology courses, literature courses, but of course he's not taught at all.
No, that's where climate change is taught, Greg.
That's right, and the foundation book of Western civilization. But then Paul is also a transition to the second half of the book, because Paul was not there when Jesus was conducting his earthly ministry. Paul met Jesus in a vision, and he had a spiritual relationship with Jesus. And that's the sort of relationship which modern Christians can have. So then the second half of the book is to examine, Christ's friends today. So that includes people who do extraordinary things because of their Christian inspiration, a woman who runs schools for poor kids in Tanzania, and another woman who confronts the sort of really destructive youth culture of today amongst her contemporaries in their 20s. It includes a number of church leaders doing very clever things in the culture. One of them, Sammy Rodriguez in America, producing Hollywood movies, which are successful, which make tens of millions of dollars and which are pro-Christian and which therefore rebut the idea that a pro-Christian message can't be commercially successful. And then there's four, political or civic leaders, ScoMo, Bill Hayden, John Anderson and Peter Cosgrove, and a number of, and then a couple of chapters on Chinese Christians, because they are so inspiring. The culture has turned against Christianity in the West, but our position is one of luxury compared to the persecution that the Chinese Christians are putting up with, which is part of Xi Jinping's new authoritarian extremism. And I talked to a few Chinese Christians over secure phone lines and try to explore why Chinese Christianity has been so dynamic under such persecution under the communists.
And so much falls from what you were just talking about. A couple of questions I have for you, Greg. Are you surprised by the success of Christians, and before Christians, God is good for you. You're certainly deeply immersed in faith, but you're not a cleric. You're not a biblical scholar. You're a working journalist and a foreign policy commentator. It's fallen on you, it seems, to be one of the preeminent defenders of faith in Australia. How has this happened, and are you tapping into a vein that's been ignored in this country for a long time?
Well, John, it's nice of you to characterise it that way, and if you're a bit puzzled by it, you can imagine I'm astounded by it, really. So part of my original motivation was just a feeling that the culture had turned against Christianity, and if you happen to have a public microphone, maybe you ought to say something. And, you know, the publishers are fantastic. Alan Unwin, I can't recommend them too highly. They're magnificent publishers, and they've done everything to make these books a success. But they had an extremely modest print run for God is Good for You, first print run, perfectly sensible. And to their astonishment and to my bewilderment, it sold infinitely better than anyone expected. And I think, John, you've worked out why. I have worked out a formula which I could write a management guru book about how to be the very best in your field. And the formula is this: enter a field in which there are no other participants. So books by secular journalists in favour of Christianity is a very small field. I am simultaneously the best in the field and the worst in the field. But I do think the culture artificially tries to white Christianity out. Maybe a half of Australians are still Christians, but they don't get a half of the airspace or a half of the characters on TV sitcoms and dramas and so on. And I also think, without, you know, praising my own work at all, there is a certain quality in trying to approach the Gospels and the New Testament as a journalist, to read them intelligently as a journalist, to look seriously at the scholarship, but not to immerse yourself in the minutiae of the scholarship, and to understand that critical scholarship can only give you so much. I mean, when I have to make a choice between the views of the early church fathers who knew the apostles personally and German Bible critics 1800 years later, I tend to go with the sources closest to the action, you know. And you can read a lot of the New Testament as a journalist. Luke is plainly the Bob Woodward of the early Jesus movement. He says in his introduction, you know, I'm Luke, you know, I dabble in being a physician, but really I'm a journalist. I've read everyone else's accounts. I've spoken to all the primary sources. Clearly, Luke got a great number of scoops from Mary, either directly or indirectly. And to read the gospel is tremendously accessible. You know, maybe 5% of it theologians puzzle about, but almost all of the gospels and almost all of Paul's letters, it's very clear what they're talking about. It's not, you know, you don't need a military escort to go into the New Testament. And I think reading it all as a journalist in a contemporary way, which doesn't mean giving it contemporary meanings, but just reading it with an attention to narrative and sources and so on, that has a certain strength, I think.
So, Greg, I'm listening to you just then. You're enthusiastic, you're engaged, you're knowledgeable, you're talking about faith, Christianity, the Bible, the Gospels in ways that I don't see church leaders talking about today. They seem to be more scared of their own shadow than anything else. Is there something about you that has prepared you to take this lead compared to the people who you would expect to be making the case that you're making? Is it as a Catholic conservative you have been inured to the slings and arrows of what people are going to say about you on Twitter? Is there something special about you compared to others?
There's nothing special about me, John, but I've had a couple of experiences that have been very helpful. Here's a paradox for you. I have spent, as you know, a great deal of my life in Asia and a great deal of my professional life in Asia. Now, Asia is intensely religious. No one in Indonesia is embarrassed about being a Muslim. They go and pray 5 times a day, and if you're having a meeting with them and they need to pray, they say, "Excuse me, you won't mind if I duck out for 5 minutes and pray, will you?" Now, in the West, we believing Christians are often sort of embarrassed by our faith. You know, you say people are, just as you characterised it, you know, people are almost apologising for it or saying, well, we don't believe the miracles really happened or something. One reason I wrote a chapter about angels is because the Bible is full of miracles and angels. And if you're a Christian and you say there are no miracles and no angels, you've got to cut out about 30% of the Bible. And if the Bible is full of lies, why bother with it anyway? I'd rather be at the races. So no one in Asia is embarrassed by religious belief. If you go to Thailand and you go to a writers' festival, the idea that you'll never hear about Buddhism, or that if you go to India, the idea that you won't hear about Hinduism. And spending a long time in Asia actually did accustom me to public figures being quite relaxed about their religious outlook. But even so, it was quite a business to come out. So I'd never hidden the fact that I was a believing Christian, but I'd just write the odd columns from the sidelines saying, you know, if the Pope's having a brawl with the communists, I'm on the Pope's side. Not hard to work out that. But actually deciding in the last book, God is Good For You, to come out and say, I believe in the four last things, you know, death, judgment, heaven, hell. I believe that Jesus Christ is my saviour. So that's quite unusual for a foreign editor. But I thought, well, you're not really saying I believe in child abuse or something. I mean, what's going to happen to you if you say it? The worst that's going to happen to you is people think you're a bit of an idiot. They think that already. Who cares, you know? So and the final thing is being relaxed about controversy. Doesn't really matter. So what does it matter to people?
What flows through and you discuss is the image the West has had of the East and of Asia as largely secular, and we tend to think of ourselves in the West as Christian in some form. So what you're saying is that role model has been reversed.
I think that's right, John. So a lot of Asian countries are intensely religious compared with the West. So the West, meaning Western Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand, religion is in some statistical decline, although there are brilliant new movements at the grassroots, which are full of life and full of hope and often led by young people. But in the rest of the world, religion is on fire. Christianity is on fire in Africa. Christians believe to the point of persecution and death in Pakistan and in the Middle East. Under terrible persecution in China, Christians have grown from 3 or 4 million when the communists took over in 1949 to somewhere between 60 or 70 million and 120 million today. That's an astounding expansion given the persecution that they've suffered. So I think the West was Christian once, I think, maybe very, very imperfectly and maybe only nominally, but at least it was nominally Christian. And that was at the time, by the way, when the rest of the world admired the West. Nobody admires the West now. They look at the West and see confusion, disarray. It's very hard to go to a young man standing on Nathan Road in Singapore and say, don't you wish you were as well governed as they are in the European Union? Don't you just wish that you had politics which could produce leaders of the kind that they've produced across Europe? And they look at you a bit sceptically. But most Asian countries are intensely religious. India, Hindu, the Philippines, Catholic, South Korea, increasingly Christian. And then the odd Asian country which is overtly non-religious, like China, has the ideology of the Communist Party. But then you find religion is spreading everywhere underneath the oppression of the Communist Party. So I think you're right. The old stereotype is the reverse of the truth.
So, Greg, before we go to the questions, many of which touch on what you've just been talking about and our video questions, to then talk about the West, what do you think has happened? And you said earlier that the pushing out of religion and especially Christianity in the public square has prompted you to write these two books. What do you think's happened in the West?
John, that's a complex and difficult question, but I'll give you the very shorthand answer. And let me say, by the way, that the chapter in a way which was the most fun to write in the book was a chapter about popular culture, because I got to talk about all the movies that I liked and all the books and TV series that I liked and all the ones that I didn't like. And here and there, you see Christianity getting back into the popular culture. I was astonished that I fell in love with the television series Jane the Virgin. And somebody was talking to me the other day and they said, imagine a crusty old bugger like you liking a TV series called Jane the Virgin. But it's a beautiful presentation of Hispanic religious faith. But what has led us to this weird moment in the West where it's almost embarrassing to admit to being a Christian? So there are two explanations. There's a long explanation, which is that the wars of the wars of religion, the wars between Catholics and Protestants, in which both sides persecuted each other, led to the discrediting of religion. There was a wrong turn taken by some of the publicists of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a very good thing, but the Oxford historian Larry Sittentop argues this was not a repudiation of Christianity, but a fulfilment of Christianity. And there are a lot of other long historical causes. But I am more drawn to the proximate cause theories, which is that the West was still very Christian right up until the end of the 1950s. And if you look at all the Academy Award best films and all the book-selling bestseller lists in the 1950s and even the early 1960s, these were predominantly Christian inspiration. Thomas Merton's The Seven-Sided Mountain sold 3 million copies when it came out. Billy Graham was the most popular figure of the 20th century. Look at the Academy Award-winning films, from How Green Was My Valley to The Sound of Music, deeply Christian films. I think two factors that I would isolate really. One was the sexual revolution, a bit unbecoming for a man of my age to talk about these things, but I do think it produced a culture which is very hostile to human flourishing, very difficult for humans to live in. I was reading a lovely book by the late Jewish Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, in which he's arguing that we are recreating the pagan life of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, which was very hypersexualized, terrible, terrible culture for women and girls. And that's what we're recreating. And it's very hard for human beings to have the warmth of life, which is conducive to religious faith in those circumstances. And then the other thing is, every human being stands in need of God's mercy because we all face the four last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell. But if you are affluent, if you are extremely affluent for a long time, if you're born into extreme affluence, you have extreme affluence, and you lead a really sort of decadent, pleasing life where very little is demanded of you and everything is given to you, you can fall for the fiction that you no longer need God's mercy. And therefore, not needing God's mercy, you also don't want God's demands on you. So you tend to try to hide God away. And then the final thing I'd say is we did develop some very obnoxious philosophies in the West. I mean, I love Western civilization, as do you, but we should remember that Nazism and communism were both born in the West. Terrible, terrible, obnoxious, foul, shocking creeds born in the West. And Nazism was extirpated, but communism has had its afterglow of all these Marxist derivative ideologies, postmodernism and so on. And so I think a combination of those things have marginalised Christianity in the West.
And talking about the West and communism and Asia, there's a wonderful discussion, and I might ask you to talk a little bit about the book because you've spoken to IPA members about it before, The Year of Living Dangerously, and why you think it's so important. And you quote one of the characters in the book, a communist who says to someone from the West, "We will win because we know what we believe, and you believe in nothing but your pleasures."
Yep, so the character who says that is Kumar, who is the communist assistant to the Australian correspondent Guy Hamilton, who works for the ABS, which is the ABC, lightly disguised, in Jakarta in 1965. The author of that book, The Year of Living Dangerously, which is the finest work of the imagination about Asia in Australian history, was the late Chris Koch, very dear friend of mine, died a few years ago. Deeply, deeply conservative Catholic novelist, but his novels are implicitly Christian, a bit like J.R.R. Tolkien. You can't really understand them without understanding his Christianity. And of course, his deep security in his own identity as a Christian allowed him to engage with Indonesian culture very deeply. And Guy Hamilton is a representative figure of his time, the 1960s. He's a good man, Guy, but he doesn't quite understand the cultural forces all around him. And he rubs up against some very hard, strong forces. Islam, which is full of belief. Communism, which is full of belief. And Kumar is a passionately believing communist. And he says to Guy, the West has no answers for us anymore. The West has nothing to teach us. Now, I think Kumar is wrong. Chris Koch is not saying that he endorses Kumar's view. But this is, even back in 1965, although the book wasn't written until 1979 or something, this is a very acute analysis of the entropy into which the West was falling as it lost its transcendent belief. And of course, I think as it loses its transcendent belief, the liberalism, which is an inheritance of Christianity, tends to go mad because it tries to invest in politics, the transcendent purpose which should be the preserve of religion.
So talking about politics, one of the key themes from many of the questions we received is summed up in a question from Tom. Why do Christian churches rush into political correctness the way they do?
Well, John, I try to be in this book pretty non-controversial.
You
it's
are.
a bit foreign to my nature, or I only want to be controversial about Christianity in this book, whereas the rest of my life I spend in hand-to-hand ideological combat all the time, But I'm not going to dodge this question at all because it's a perfectly legitimate question. I think a combination of things. The other thing that has led to the, marginalisation of Christianity certainly is the shocking scandals we've seen amongst some churches, not least my own church, the Catholic Church. These clerical child sexual abuse scandals are the most terrible things I've ever heard about my church. It's not the only thing my church has done in the last 40 years, but it's a shocking scandal. But I do think so many church leaders are so browbeaten, they're so intimidated by the culture that they're getting a bit shy about what is their very countercultural message. Mm. So the message of Christianity is in favour of the good things of the West, human rights, democracy, freedom, and civility and decency. But it is also always bringing mankind up against his shortcomings and saying, no, you have to exercise greater charity than that. No, you have to turn the other cheek to your enemies. That doesn't mean you can't do self-defence, especially defence of others, but it means you have to have an attitude of forgiveness and so on, and a whole lot of other things. Now, one of the responsibilities of our moment in history is that although we are browbeaten and marginalised by the culture, we still have to proclaim the truth. But I do think a lot of folks get very timid about that, and then they look for something where they can have common ground with the predominant culture. And so there is an element of wokeness which is okay. If wokeness simply says, let's be kind to minorities, okay, we can all go along with that. Or if wokeness says, let's be against racism, I'll march for that every day of the week and twice on Sundays. But of course, the next step wokeism takes is normally madness, extremity, distortion, illiberalism, coercion. And I do think some Christians are inclined to say, well, if we just go with the flow there as far as we can, they won't beat us up if we don't talk about, abortion or the sanctity of human life or euthanasia or religious freedom or anything else. So that's a long-winded way of saying I kind of agree with the thrust of that question.
And then to come back to something we've touched on, and again, as I mentioned earlier before we went live, many questions about your views on Christianity in China, which you talk about extensively in the book. And so, for example, one question is from Chris. How did Christians in China survive under Mao? And how have we got to a situation now where, as you say, there might be potentially 100 million Christians of various denominations in China?
Well, you really, John, in my view, you really have to believe in the actions of the divine to explain Chinese Christianity. And we should never judge Chinese civilization by the Chinese Communist Party. Communism is a wretched, wretched, wretched Western export to China. And the Communist Party spent its first decades absolutely denouncing traditional Chinese culture. I was a correspondent in China in 1985 when they rehabilitated Confucius. And they've now become, the Chinese communists, extremely nationalists, as communists always do. And they've tried to recruit Confucius, and they only take the pro-authority bits of Confucius. They leave out all the great bits about the responsibility of the ruler and how you can sacrifice the mandate of heaven and so on. Incidentally, the greatest sinologist in Australian history, Pierre Ryckmans, a great Belgian, was also a deeply committed, profoundly believing Christian, and secure in his Christian identity, he could embrace a dialogue with Chinese culture. And his translation of the Analects of Confucius, he has in his foreword a magnificent defence of Christianity. And he says, just as you can hear Confucius's distinctive voice in his Analects, so you can hear Jesus's distinctive voice in the Gospels, although Confucius, of course, doesn't claim to be divine. But the Chinese Christians were subject to the most terrible persecution. Initially, when the communists took over, they kind of left the Christians alone. But then in the 50s, very severe persecution came along. Then in the Cultural Revolution, the persecution went into kind of hyperspace, and it even got to the point where priests and nuns were put in cages in cathedrals, which were not allowed to be used as houses of worship, and mocked and lampooned and had things thrown at them by members of the public. There was savage persecution. I myself have interviewed Chinese who've been decades and decades in prison, lost their whole lives in prison for the crime of being Christian. Now, in the face of all that, how did this movement flourish? It's unbelievable. There was a bit of relaxation in the 1980s, and then a bit of relaxation in the first years of this century. And in both of those times, there was a great flowering of the Protestant home church movement. So this was really, so there are about 10 million Catholics and about somewhere between 70 and 100 million home church-based independent Christians, or you could call them Protestants. And they are answering a terrible need amongst the Chinese. So Marxism, communism is a kind of religion, but it's a very shabby religion. It tries to provide existential purpose to life, but its metaphysics are very dusty, very implausible. And the emptiness of official Chinese communist life. So Christianity in China does attract the marginalised, but what the Communist Party hates about it is that it attracts the successful, the intelligent, the well-educated, young Chinese men and women who understand deep viscerally that there is more to life than materialism and the Chinese Communist Party. And the Chinese Christians I spoke to, their methods of evangelization were the oldest in the world. They just go to a friend and say, hey, have you heard the good news about Jesus and the gospel? He's your saviour. He loves you. Why don't you come round home and we'll talk about it? We're having a few friends round tonight. And this just spread, and they've never had genuine independence at any moment. The Christians have never been allowed to live freely. Now, Xi Jinping, in a series of moves after he took power, has reversed the modest liberalisation of the early noughties. So now you cannot sell a Bible except in a church. Churches have been required, like Buddhist temples, to put up photographs of Xi Jinping and to acknowledge that the head of the church is the Chinese Communist Party. So the Chinese Communist Party is notionally atheist, but the Christian churches are supposed to, acknowledge that it is the head of the churches. Now, I think the Chinese Christians, they're not inherently political. They just want to lead a decent life. They're very much like the early Christians. They're not overtly trying to bring down the Roman Empire. And the Chinese Communist Party very much resembles the Roman Empire. So the Roman emperors became deities, just like Mao and Xi Jinping have become effective deities. The Chinese Christians have endured astounding persecution, and yet they've grown and grown and grown, and they seem, as far as you can tell, to continue to be growing. Now, perhaps there's a terrible showdown coming. where Xi Jinping casts off all restraint and goes after Christians with the same savagery as happened in the Cultural Revolution. I certainly hope that doesn't happen. Or perhaps there's just this uneasy oppression. And I don't think the Communist Party can stop the Christians of China. And they won't overthrow the Communist Party or anything, but they will create a better China. And when it gets through this communist madness, there'll be something to start rebuilding with.
And can I say to everyone watching my discussion with Greg now, in Greg's book, Christians, there's a very powerful discussion about Christianity in China. Greg, can we go to our first video question from Dr. Bella De Brera, Director of the Foundations of Western Civilization program at the IPA?
Hi, Greg. My question for you is, do you think the rejection of Christianity in this country has left a void that is being filled by strange gods like the new COVID health regime that we have, which has all the hallmarks of religion, so ritual like washing your hands, social distancing, mask wearing, and even the concept of sin where the unvaccinated are being ostracized as sinners?
So what a joy it is to be asked a question by Bella, for whom I have the greatest possible admiration. And Bella put up with having to talk with me about my 5 favourite books, and what a joy it was to have that dialogue. So I agree with you, Bella, in this sense. I absolutely agree that the decline of transcendent belief in the West means that political activists are desperate to seek meaning in their lives, and they inject every political dispute they have with a bizarre, absurd, totalitarian quality of meaning. So unless you take the knee and pledge your allegiance to Black Lives Matter, and, you know, I like you, John, am completely, absolutely, 1,000,000% against racism of any kind, but I'm not going to perform these silly rituals with all their totalitarian ideological associations. But unless you do that, you are a racist. Similarly, unless you embrace every jot and tittle of whatever the gender ideology of the day is, and it keeps changing, you are a heteronormative sexist. So even J.K. Rowling, for the famous novelist, for arguing that women are women, she becomes a public villain. And with each passing fantasy, with each passing obsession, whether it's COVID or gender or something else. So, you know, one of the best politicians in Australia, a lovely guy, was Kim Beazley. I interviewed him for my last book. He was very reluctant to be interviewed. He's a very deeply believing Christian. But he said, you know, mate, my politics is not my religion. It's not a sin to disagree with me. I don't want to suggest to anybody that there's some divine warrant about my policy. Now, look, I have views on COVID, and, you know, I could be wrong. Who knows? But it's not a question of religious intensity. You know, I'd hate for politics to be everything in life. You know, I engage in politics with great enthusiasm, but I'd hate it to be the only source of meaning in my life.
And then, Greg, you've raised an important point about politics is now everything. And I and many others were concerned when Kevin Rudd famously said, the question of climate change is a moral question. He didn't say it's an economics question, a politics question, a science question, a geography question. He said it's a moral question. And as soon as you define your opponent as immoral, then you remove any standing of them to argue a contrary case. It is almost like a religion, the way we talk about some of these things, whether it's critical race theory, identity politics, or climate change. When did politics become a moral purpose, or has it always been a moral purpose, but now without religion, it's the only moral purpose we have?
Yeah, well, John, I mean, I couldn't agree more with your analysis. I think that's 100% right. Again, the great Larry Siddentop is very enlightening on all this. His great book, Inventing the Individual, The Birth of Western Liberalism or something, traces liberalism as completely a subset of Christianity, modern Western liberalism. Now, you know, I spend my life with other cultures and so on, and I esteem them greatly, and the human genius provides its own route to universal human values through different cultures. But no other civilization produced liberalism in the way that the West did. Now, Larry Siddentop, who I don't think is particularly a believing Christian, but a great historian, his book, Inventing the Individual, the greatest book of history I've ever read, he argues that it was the dialogue of Christianity which produced modern liberalism. So human rights came from the idea that human beings were created in the image of God, and then the idea that the essential human relationship was the relationship that each individual had with God. This was tremendous liberation for women and girls, because women and girls were equal to men in their relationship with God. Christianity produced a sexual revolution which was very pro-woman, and the liberalism, like all truths, is something which you need to hold in balance. So there are truths which balance each other. You know, things, you need to be representative, but on the other hand, if the public goes crazy, there are limits to representative. You know, you can't, if the public's all vote Nazi, it's still wrong. It's still wrong. So this is one of Chesterton's great insights, that all truth involves a balance. But when you remove completely liberalism from its Christian roots, you remove it from a living culture, you remove it from common sense, you remove it from balance, and you remove it from a sort of a sense that there is an absolute which puts the relative in perspective. So then it's just your feeling of enthusiasm for whatever your cause is. And this is not, ultimately, this won't only be confined to the left. This is most evident on the left, but I think you also see right-wing extremists. You know, one of my favourite columnists, Ross Douthat, the Christian conservative at the New York Times, one of his great lines that I often quote is, he said, if you didn't like the Christian right in America, you just wait till you meet the post-Christian right. The left is crazy to think that by banishing Christianity, it's always going to win. No, it's going to lose again, but the people it loses to will be much uglier than the people it used to lose to a generation ago.
Can we go to the second question, which was from Paul?
Hi, Greg. Can a liberal democracy survive without Christianity?
So that's a $64 million question, Paul. I'm so glad you asked it, because I have a really unpopular answer to that. And let me give you the headline straight away. I think the answer is no, it probably can't. There is a species of conservative commentators whom I love and admire. Douglas Murray, Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland, great men, great writers, great thinkers. And I shared a platform with Douglas Murray in London a year or two ago, and we discussed this very question. So their view, none of them I think is quite a professing Christian, but they all hold the view that the cultural value of Christianity to the West is overwhelming, and that if the West rejects this cultural value, it will do itself enormous harm. And I was having this discussion with Douglas Murray at a seminar sponsored, would you believe, by the Hungarian government in London. So who else is going to invite Douglas Murray and me to be two of their panelists, you know? And I put it to him, I said, Douglas, what you argue is very beautiful, and it's very appealing to, you know, a 67-year-old conservative or something. We can sit down, and I'm not quite 67, but we can sit down and say, well, you know, I may not hold this as a belief, but it's been very useful. I can see over my lifetime it's had great social utility, and it's helped people come together and so on. But you cannot sell that message to an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old or a 25-year-old, full of the passionate intensity of youth, full of that selflessness, that desire to identify with a great transcendent cause, full of that willingness to spend their human life in something heroic and magnificent and transcendent. And you cannot say to them, I want you to adopt the norms and values and customs of something which I believe to be completely phony and superstitious nonsense. It just doesn't wash. Now, I'm not saying this as a normative thing. I'm not requiring my good friends to become Christians or anything like that. Not a bit, not a bit. And of course, people can lead wonderful lives without any religious belief, you know, some of my best friends, etc. But I don't really think the West can survive as the West. And I quote a great philosopher, Jacques Maritain, to this effect. I don't think the West can survive as the West if it abandons transcendent belief. That would be my analytical guess. I could well be wrong, But your questioner asked me to make a judgment, so I'll give you my judgment. The answer is no, I don't think it can survive without. And of course, we're facing competition from societies which are full of transcendent belief. The Chinese Communist Party really believes in itself. The Islamist societies, they really believe in themselves. Even Modi's Hindu India, it is not having an identity crisis. It doesn't spend its time thinking that Hinduism is the worst thing that humanity ever created, as we do in the West. And if we lose the source of our inspiration, which is Christianity, now, you shouldn't believe in Christianity in order to save Western civilization, but I do think it's almost impossible for Western civilization to flourish without Christianity.
And that then leads to the next question from Chetna, one of our wonderful staff members here at the IPA. And Chetna wanted me to ask you, Greg, as a Hindu living in Australia, I find no one questions my faith, but they do seem to question Christianity. Why is that?
Well, that's a very interesting observation. So I have the closest personal connections with Sikh, members of the Sikh faith, and I've got very close friends who are members of different faiths. And believers really seldom are a problem for each other in Western societies. I've never heard a believing Hindu or a believing Sikh or even a believing Muslim object to the celebration of Christmas, for example. I've never heard that. I did an ABC program, The Drum, recently, talking about my book, and they're talking about Scott Morrison's, very straightforward statement of Christian belief in my book. And a Muslim woman was on the panel, and she said, I'm so thrilled to hear Scott Morrison speak that way, because his courage in attesting to his faith makes me feel less embarrassed about my faith. She didn't use the word less embarrassed, but makes me feel less self-conscious or something about my faith. Now, generally speaking, believers get on with each other fine. What has happened, I think, in the West is that a very grumpy, bad-tempered cohort of baby boomers have defined themselves by their rejection of their parents' values, part of which was Christian religion. They hold the commanding heights of the culture, and they've tried to reproduce themselves in their successors, and they almost don't know anything that they believe in, except that they believe Christianity is bad and repressive and sexist and heteronormative and racist and colonialist and everything else, any ist you can think of. And they, I think, are the source of anti-Christian animus in the West. It's not migrants from other faith communities. I've never myself heard a mainstream, and certainly I'm very close to the Jewish community. I've never ever struck any hostility to Christianity from anyone else in a faith community. I strike it from the sort of Western folks who are so alienated from their own cultural inheritance.
Can that alienation be overcome?
Well, yes, I think it can. One of the people I interview in the book is a guy named Nicky Gumbel, an Anglican rector in Holy Trinity, Brompton, in London, who is the progenitor of this fabulous Alpha course, which has led millions of people to Christianity. It's an approach to introducing young people to Christianity, and millions of people around the world have come to Christianity. It's used now by all the church denominations. And he referred me to an interesting historic moment. He said, in 1750, in St Paul's Cathedral in London, 16 people came to the Easter services, 16 people. And there were 10,000 sex workers walking the streets of London. And you would have said Christianity was finished in England, just finished. And then along came the Wesleys and the Great Methodist Revival and Wilberforce and the Great Revival all through Britain of Christianity. You got, what do they call it, the Second Awakening in the United States. You got Billy Graham then in the 20th century. And there was this enormous flowering of Christianity from nothing in 1750 to absolutely as great as it had ever been by 1950. And there's absolutely no reason for us to think that this little eccentric moment of madness is our destiny. And if it is our destiny, that's a pretty horrible destiny. But even whether we're sort of, it's not even a question of how brave you are, there's no reason to think that this is our destiny, because it's against human nature. See, we start with a tremendous advantage in the argument. We're telling the truth. and the things we're saying are consistent with human nature. So that gives us a big advantage, even if the other side seems to control the most powerful institutions.
One of the themes of the questions was, do you think, Greg, COVID is making us more religious or will make us more religious?
So that's also a complex question, John. In some ways, I think it is, yes, and there's well-attested sociological evidence of this. People, are going on the internet searching for God and meaning and Christ and Jesus and so on very extensively. On the other hand, I tell you one public policy thing I am very disappointed about is the absolute insouciance of governments in banning religious services. They seem to have put more heavy restrictions on religious services. An Anglican friend of mine in Sydney was telling me he could go, this is a month or two ago, he could go to a theatrical event in which every seat was occupied and people on the stage were singing, but he couldn't have people in his church and have them sing. Now, in the Spanish flu 100 years ago, they briefly outlawed church services and there was nearly a civil insurrection. And of course, the Christian pastors of all denominations were fantastically heroic. They wanted to go and minister to the people dying of the influenza, even though it meant it was very likely that they would get influenza and die themselves. Their heroism was absolutely magnificent. And people wanted their Christian services, and the government had to sort of relent and say, okay, well, you can do outdoor Christian services, wear a mask, hold your service outdoors. Almost every parish church I know has a big car park. You could easily hold the services outdoors. I've been a bit surprised at how little regard governments have given to religious services and how little effort religious leaders have made. So I'm not entering the general argument about, COVID measures, but I can't understand why religious services are regarded as less important than a liquor store or a musical theatre experience or something like this. I think that's a sign of the culture getting its values wrong.
And that then touches on our last video question from great friend of the IPA, Father James Grant.
Well, hello, Greg. Just a short question for you. I'm wondering to what extent the decline of Australian Christianity in all of the major denominations is the result of poor church leadership.
I think,
well,
Greg,
Father
James is asking you to be controversial.
Right. Well, Father James, it's great to kind of finally make your acquaintance even on video. And of course, I know so much about you by good reputation. And but I think you should go to confession after that case and say, after that question and say, I tried to lead my interlocutor into an occasion of sin. And now I would only say this. Most of the church leaders I meet these days are pretty good. They're pretty good. I do think there was I'm very prone to military metaphors and military comparisons. And a very dangerous time for any military commander is when the political leadership doesn't have a full appreciation of the realities on the field, because on the field of battle, they set down guidelines then which make life harder for their troops on the field of battle. And I think Christian leadership suffered this disjunction between what it thought it knew and what was actually happening for some time. So until 5 minutes ago, Christianity was not only the majority in Australia, it was the consensus in Australia. I mean, when I entered journalism in 1979, the statements, so I lived in Sydney then, the statements of the Sydney Anglican Archbishop, the Sydney Catholic Bishop, the leader of the Salvation Army, these were giant public figures. If Cardinal Gilroy said something, everybody listened. If Dr. Lone said something, everybody listened. And church leaders developed a style of leadership which kind of suited that period. They'd make statements, people would respond to them, they'd be treated with a lot of respect. So I think now we have to conceive of ourselves as a radical minority, and we want minority rights, which is not so much rights for ourselves, but rights for the truth. We don't want illiberal, coercive ideology imposed on Christian institutions. One reason I write these books is to encourage all Christians to own their beliefs in public, which provides solidarity for fellow Christians and a signpost for people who aren't Christians. And I think, so I don't favour one denomination over another. I try to operate to right from that mere Christianity consensus that C.S. Lewis talked about, where any Christian who can who can sign up to the Apostles' Creed, that's fine. The 99% we agree on is much more important than the 1% we disagree on. And all denominations can teach each other different things. But I am tremendously impressed by the Pentecostals. So they don't have the great institutions that Catholics and Anglicans have, the church, the schools, the universities, the hospitals, but they're a very contemporary movement. In their current guise, they've only been going for 5 minutes, really. And as a result, they're very comfortable with contemporary culture. So their use of social media, their use of music, contemporary music, the Pentecostal American minister that I interview, he makes Hollywood movies. He's made 3 Hollywood movies, which have been tremendously successful and are very pro-Christian. One of them cost him $10 million to make, made worldwide revenues of $50 million, was nominated for an Academy Award. Now, that is absolute proof positive that pro-Christian things can work in the marketplace, but it's also really effective Christian leadership. Now, that's not, making movies is not the prime thing of Christian leadership at all, but this is really creative contemporary leadership. I had dinner with a Pentecostal leader a year or 2 ago, and he had a doctorate, and I thought, well, this will be in biblical studies or Christology or something like that. His doctorate was in organisational leadership. So he was interested, he knew what he believed, but he was interested in organisational leadership. So I do think Christian leaders need to be much more effective in their leadership. So, and I'll finish this with this thought. When we have a Christian hospital today, it doesn't use the methods of 300 years ago. It uses the most up-to-date, brilliant, contemporary clinical methods to serve its eternal purpose, which is to make people well. But in their governance structures, the traditional Christian leadership is often using structures which are a few hundred years old and worked pretty well for a few hundred years, but the structures themselves aren't the important thing. The important thing is the purpose, and the purpose is to communicate, Christ's message and so on. And I think they could update the structures. Now, having said that, let me not pretend to be the source of perfect wisdom here, and those poor fools just haven't thought it out because they're not as clever as me. I mean, moving these things does take time. There's not a single Christian leader I've met now, though, who isn't grappling quite hard with this. And I interviewed 4 Christian leaders in this book, and I think they're all working very effectively to answer these problems. And of course, the fact that they're working on it doesn't mean that they're going to have instant success. So James, I've avoided the temptation which you gave me, and I know you were merely testing me there.
Greg, I think that is a wonderful way to conclude what has been a terrific discussion. Can I congratulate you again on Christians, the urgent case for Jesus in our world, available in all bookshops when they reopen, but more importantly, available online from the publisher Allen and Unwin. Greg, on behalf of not just IPA members, but on behalf of so many Australians, can I thank you for what you do, and can I say Christians is a wonderful book and an important book, and you have provided a great service to Australia and to liberal democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks everyone who participated tonight.
That concludes this special edition of IPA Encounters. Thank you for joining me in this discussion with Greg Sheridan on his new book, Christians, the Urgent Case for Jesus in Our World. You can purchase your copy online from Booktopia or from all good bookshops. If you're not already a member of the Institute of Public Affairs, you can take part in live online events like this by becoming an IPA member at ipa.org.au/join.